United States lags behind the rest of the world when it comes to passenger trains, but when it comes to the freight railroad, the U.S. is dominating. The freight rail network in the U.S. operates over 140,000 miles of privately owned track in every state except for Hawaii. It moves 1/3 of all U.S. exports and roughly 40% of long-distance freight volume.
The North American freight rail network is considered the most efficient, the largest, and the most profitable freight rail network in the world.
It competes directly with the trucking industry to move goods around the country, shipping everything from coal to cars to chemicals. And with the rise of e-commerce companies like Amazon, trains are increasingly moving consumer goods as well.
If you see it on a shelf, we likely had a hand in moving it.
There are 7 major freight railroads that connect North America. Union Pacific and BNSF dominate the West. CSX and Norfolk Southern are the primary East Coast operators, while Kansas City Southern, along with Canadian Pacific and Canadian National, run routes north and south. Amtrak, which is the United States passenger service, owns only 3% of the country's rail. In 2019, the top 5 railroads in the U.S. had a total operating revenue of over $71 billion. BNSF, a subsidiary of Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, is not publicly traded, but the remaining 4 U.S. companies have seen their stock on a steady climb over the last several years.
The railroads are incredibly profitable and actually are achieving profits that they've never seen in their entire history. That unfortunately is not true for passenger railroad. Amtrak continues to lose money. It's the only major for-profit railroad in the United States that hauls passengers, and yet it has never made a profit.
The future of freight demand in this country is strong. Estimates of 30 to 40% increases in freight demand between now and the next few decades are prevalent.
But the freight rail industry's success has not come without its challenges. The industry has dealt with bankruptcies, the lack of demand for coal, and the more recent supply chain bottlenecks and rise in thefts. The 7 top railroads, which own the majority of the tracks in North America, have also been criticized for monopolistic power over the rail industry.
They tend to be very oligopolic and have an enormous amount of power in pricing, and there isn't a lot of competition.
CNBC explores how freight railroads became so profitable and how the industry plans to evolve to stay on top. The U.S. railroad dates back to the year 1830, before airplanes or automobiles were even invented. Passenger rail and freight were in high demand to move people and things around the expanding country.
It's been an economic backbone of the United States, and in many ways plays a core and central theme in American history, and particularly the state of the economy.
The railroad has seen many high and low points. By 1917, 1,500 railroads operated on 254,000 miles of track. The 40s and 50s brought the rise of cars, air travel, and trucking. Up until that point, there was basically no competition for passenger or freight rail besides other railroad companies, and the industry was subject to federal regulation that set rates and profit levels.
After World War II, the federal government built this incredible interstate highway network and really lit trucking on fire, but didn't relax the regulatory standards on the rail industry, even though the competition increased dramatically.
It wasn't until 1980, when the Staggers Act was enacted, that these regulations were loosened. It allowed railroads to choose routes, prices, and services, and brought profits back to the railroads. Since then, many redundant routes and railroad mergers have consolidated the industry.
There was a series of about 5 or 6 different mergers that allowed the Union Pacific to be the 32,000 miles of mainline track that we see here today.
Without M&A, chances are that rail as a percent of overall freight would be a much less important part of our domestic freight network.
Kansas City Southern just recently agreed to merge with Canadian Pacific, and if the Surface Transportation Board approves, it will create the only railroad linking Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. Today, the U.S. has some of the most profitable freight railroad businesses in the world, achieving billions in profits. Passenger rail, however, has not seen a similar comeback.
While freight railroads have invested at least $25 billion a year over year into their networks over the past several decades, passenger rail has not had the same level of benefit. When it comes to Amtrak, the federal government has traditionally been the primary funder of Amtrak, and the amount of funding pales in comparison to funding levels that have occurred in other countries.
Experts say geography and privatization of the rail freight industry is why some consider it to be the most efficient in the world.
The rest of the world does things quite a bit differently. In most of the rest of the world, the rail network is nationalized. It isn't owned by a particular company.
The United States geography is the primary reason that freight railroad and the freight network in the United States is far superior to what you see in other countries. A lot of what railroads depend upon are bulk commodities, agricultural commodities, and mining that we get out of the ground. And a lot of those materials come from the center part of the country. And because these are going to non-populated areas, rail is really well positioned and is a far superior mode of traffic than you see with trucks.
These companies compete with each other, but also must work together and coordinate shipments since there is not one central owner of the railroad.
In order for us to provide service for a customer, say from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast, we have to hand off those products, those boxes, those carloads to a different carrier on the east side of the network.
Freight railroads are what I like to call the middle miles. And so when you're looking at international traffic, for example, on the West Coast, you have ships bringing in goods, and those are transloaded either directly into train or into truck. Train takes the long miles, the middle miles of those trips, and then hands those off to truck often at the end of the trip. So we all work together as one overall network.
Through the reduction of companies and consolidation, railroad market power has increased.
They are occasionally brought up in front of the regulators for not servicing, but also not charging fair market rates. They're constantly under the lens and constantly accused of exercising more monopolistic practices in their pricing. Not so much on the intermodal traffic, which has to sort of stay naturally competitive with truck traffic, but more so on the bulk goods that there isn't really an equivalent truck competition.
The Biden administration issued an executive order last July that calls for regulation on the freight industry, targeting a practice known as reciprocal switching. Reciprocal switching is intended to foster more competitive environments for shippers. Because the freight companies own certain stretches of track, the regulation would force them to open up the tracks to other freight companies, giving shippers more options of who to work with and therefore creating a more competitive market. The practice is already common in Canada, and some freight railroads have switching agreements which came as a result of previous mergers. When Amtrak was created, part of the deal was its passenger trains would still have access to tracks owned by the freight companies. Amtrak pays host railroads $142 million a year to use their tracks.
It comes at a time when we're trying to move as much freight as we can throughout the supply chain, and to do anything that would knowingly undermine the fluidity of the freight network is frankly wrong-headed and at odds with the overarching goal of maximizing freight movement. The system works. The Surface Transportation Board is in place to adjudicate rate disputes and determine whether or not a particular rate might be reasonable or not.
The Surface Transportation Board, the agency who oversees economic regulation in the industry, is holding a public hearing to discuss the matter in March.